I wanted to do like a big deep dive on the Elder Scrolls 6 and go into all the details and all the interviews and all the whisperings and things of what Todd Howard has discussed previously and really delve into it. But there just frankly isn't a whole lot there. And I've dug around, I've tried to find it. There are little rumblings, like around the time of Fallout 4, he was interviewed about the next generation of RPGs and where he thought like gaming was going. And he said stuff like, I think heavily suggesting things for Starfield, which at the time was not even announced. And then he also hinted at some stuff that was directly related to a fantasy game. So almost certainly the Elder Scrolls 6. But back in like 2015, he was saying stuff like, oh yeah, I was seeing some of the tech that people on our team are working on. And it's just crazy, you know, the ability to just walk up and approach a big building, and then you can hear the conversations going on inside the building before you even step inside. That's something that only the next generation of hardware is going to be capable of doing, and we're really excited about it and all of that. And like interesting concepts and stuff, but almost a decade ago, some of that might have been really exciting, especially for Bethesda games where you had to load into separate buildings whenever you wanted to go inside. But nowadays, that's not like, that's not really that novel. That's not that crazy, right? It's just a thing that happens. You know, like you're playing Red Dead 2, which released at this point, I know it's crazy to think of, but going on 6 years ago. Red Dead 2, 6 years ago. Yeah, let that settle in. In that game, yeah, you walk up to just, I must call it a tavern. It's not a tavern, a saloon. You walk up to a saloon and you can hear the people inside talking and partying, playing cards, whatever. You can hear the piano player before you even go inside. And so it's not that novel of a concept now, but back in 2015, maybe it was more interesting or different. So we know that they've been eyeing technical features for a while. They have some ideas of what they want to do with the Elder Scrolls 6, of where they want to go with it, what they want to be able to achieve with it. But specifics have been very tough to pin down. And even when like directly asked in recent years what they plan to do with it, Todd's been very, very vague. For example, one of the things he's said repeatedly is that he wants the next Elder Scrolls game to be the ultimate fantasy simulator, basically. He wants it to be the ultimate fantasy game. And some people see that and they get really excited. But here's the thing. Every salesman is going to tell you that their product is the best thing ever. It's just what happens, right? Like if you go to a Honda dealership, the Honda salesman is going to be telling you why Honda cars are better than Toyotas. It might be like, he won't say that, oh, they're more, maybe they hold their value better, because that's not, like, that's verifiably not true in some cases. Maybe the better example is like, maybe it's like a Lambo dealership versus a Honda dealership. You go to the Lambo dealership, the Lambo salesman is going to be talking to you about how amazing the engine is, the tech, how great and fast it is, how it's a sports car. It'll turn heads. Everybody's going to be obsessed with you, think that you're super cool. But then you go to the like Honda dealership and they're going to be talking about, oh yeah, we don't do the stuff the Lambo does, but we do all of this stuff that Lambo doesn't do. We're affordable, so you can still own a house while affording this car. And they go through all of the other things. So no matter who you talk to, they're always going to be talking about how their product is the best fit, and they're going to emphasize the good stuff and then just pretend the bad stuff or the downsides of it don't exist and not really talk about that, because that's just how this works. And for somebody like Todd Howard, if he's going to talk about the Elder Scrolls 6, he's going to talk about all the things he wants to achieve. He's going to be talking about all the dreams and aspirations the team have, but that doesn't really mean much of anything because it's all about execution and the final product. Who cares what the goal was if the end result doesn't live up to it? I can tell you, like, oh yes, my upcoming video, my goal is for it to be the best YouTube video anybody has ever seen, to bring you to tears, make you rethink your entire life, and it will also make you grow 6 inches. You get to choose where and how and in which direction. That's a cool concept. We all would love it if the video ended up being like that, but it probably won't. And you shouldn't just blindly take it on faith that that's what's going to happen, right? What's interesting about this, though, is that Todd has said very clearly that he somewhat regrets announcing the Elder Scrolls 6 when they did. Now, the Elder Scrolls 6 was announced back in 2018. And what was interesting is that it was revealed as part of this showcase in 2018, where at the time it was a little surprising because we were like, why are they doing all of this right now? And I think that there were multiple layers to this that informed it and caused it. On the one hand, at the time, Bethesda had just announced Fallout 76, and people were pretty skeptical of that. People were kind of weirded out by it. And so I think what they were doing was like 2 or 3-fold. I think that they knew that their core fans maybe were not going to be that stoked about a live service Fallout game. So they wanted to make it clear that they were working on other single player stuff as well, in the form of Starfield and the Elder Scrolls 6. So they're like, look, we're working on this stuff too. We haven't forgotten about it. We're also doing all this. It would be like if Rocksteady announced Suicide Squad and then also on the side announced like the next Batman Arkham game. And they're like, yeah, we know you might not love the live service thing, but we're also doing this. So if you're not into this game right here, you can be excited for this other one. And I think that that's part of what was going on. So they were trying to remind everybody that they had both things and both pots on the stove. He's also said that they wanted to avoid the constant, incessant nagging about the Elder Scrolls 6 and just be like, yeah, we're working on it. See, look, here's a trailer. Doesn't tell you much of anything, but yes, we're working on it. But I think the other piece of this puzzle is that they really wanted to flex to Microsoft before the ZeniMax acquisition. Because at this time, allegedly, negotiations were ongoing. They were talking to Phil Spencer about it, and they wanted to prove how valuable they were. So they announced all this stuff and got a ton of interest and hype built up around it. And I think that that was a big part of it. I think they wanted to show how big their IP were and how successful Xbox could be if they were to acquire them. And that's why they revealed all of this stuff at the same time. And then of course they went and revealed Starfield at the same show. What he said was, quote, "It's like, I don't want to answer, but I want to be polite," Howard said after being asked for any details on Elder Scrolls 6. "I will say that we want it to fit that role of the ultimate fantasy world simulator, and there are different ways to accomplish that given the time that has passed." I think in the context of it specifically, it was time that has passed since the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. So yeah, interestingly, Howard kind of sort of already casually announced the Elder Scrolls 6 back in 2016, 2 years before the game's official teaser and E3 announcement. In an interview with Jeff Keighley back then, Howard confirmed that Bethesda was indeed going to make Elder Scrolls 6, but warned it was still a very long way off. He wasn't joking. He's just been very, very coy. And I mean, this is really the extent of the teases we've gotten with regard to the game, is that they want it to be the ultimate fantasy world simulator, and there's different ways to do that given the time that's passed. I think that's a great ambition. I don't know, did I say coward? That's funny. I don't know how they're going to be able to go head to head with some of the competition now, though, if they're trying to do the same thing. And this is something we've talked about before on stream. Is like, if Skyrim were to launch today with modern graphics, with modern, for Bethesda, modern, but if it were to release today with the same design document as if they had one, the same mechanics, everything, it's just with a fresher coat of paint, basically, and nobody had ever played it before, it was a brand new game, would it cause the same, flood, same tsunami of hype and interest, and would it take the world by storm again? Because back when it launched, it really did. It was everywhere. And honestly, I don't think it would. I don't think modern gamers are that into the classical BGS style of game design. I just don't think they are. It's not necessarily a diss. I just think times have changed a little bit. And the competition has introduced some other really novel and interesting ideas to excite people. So I don't know if it would be that successful. So how are they going to approach the next game? Are they going to really rework it, refocus it? Are they going to try to do something really novel and different? Or is it just going to be Skyrim 2? I think that's a really valid question. Yeah, this was the initial announcement of Starfield. And then he gets into the Elder Scrolls 6.
Boom goes the dynamite.
Starfield is a game that we have spent years thinking about and working on. Something we feel uniquely positioned to pull off and that we're incredibly excited about.
I find it really interesting that he's like uniquely positioned. Like they thought that they were the team to make Starfield great. Whereas now I think everybody's looking at it and be like, no, I think you might be like one of the worst studios in terms of like your tech capabilities to pull this off. You know, it's like the actual opposite of that. It's very funny, very interesting.
But we're also building toward the game after that. And it's the one
Are we getting
you
another
keep asking
tease?
about.
Okay.
I don't know whose video this is that's talking. Triple S League. Standing ovation.
Thank you.
Those are probably the devs.
Okay, actually, now I'm really done. I just want to thank you all for your time tonight, the time you've spent in our worlds. We'll see you out.
So I think, Mr. Todd, I think this was multifaceted. It was a reveal partially to calm fans down, which it didn't really do, but it was also to calm them down with regards to the live service game that they were making and remind them that they were still a single player studio, because Fallout 76 was almost certainly built to appease ZeniMax executives trying to sell the company. And I also think they were revealing all of this stuff at the same time, probably because they wanted to show Xbox during the negotiations how excited everybody was for the IP that they would get and for the games they would get on their platform after they purchased. Because at the time, I mean, Starfield and Elder Scrolls 6 were just future projects. Xbox could buy them and release those exclusively on the Xbox Series consoles, which was super thrilling for Xbox during this time to have these as exclusives. And that's part of what they were doing by revealing it here. But now it's funny because you look back and you wonder just like where the game was at this point. And it also makes you really question a lot of the premises of this. Like he says, yeah, we're uniquely positioned to pull off Starfield. And after we got Starfield, we found out that the opposite was true. They were probably one of the worst teams technologically capable or just in terms of overall staff. They were not capable of pulling that off. They weren't equipped to pull it off, but they thought, like they really thought they were. And that makes you question all the other stuff with the Elder Scrolls 6. And I think the other piece of the puzzle too with this, you guys are right. I'm so sorry. The Todd candle needs to go on. The other piece of this too is just that Bethesda seemingly does not engage with critiques or people who are not big into their games or have problems with them. They kind of consider them to be haters. And the problem with that is that when you kind of stick your fingers in your ears, Todd, calm down. He does not like it when I talk about him like this. The problem with that is that it prevents you from ever making any sort of changes or improvements or anything when you just refuse to entertain any sort of I would argue valid critique, or maybe just constructive criticism or whatever. And like, I try to, we try to be entertaining and stuff on stream and stuff. I do hear people who are like, oh my God, Luke, stop talking about Suicide Squad or stop talking about Starfield or whatever else. Cause I want to entertain that critique and be like, okay, is that valid? Is that something that I should stop doing? Cause the only reason I talk about it really is, for one, it's fun for me, but also because people seem to still be interested in discussions regarding that game. And that's kind of where I evaluate the critique and then try to come to a conclusion from there. But when you look at the interviews and the interviews that Emil Pagliarulo has done, he's one of the head honchos at BGS, and he has given multiple talks at GDC, multiple interviews and stuff over the years. And often his conclusion with a lot of this stuff is to just kind of ignore criticism. Just don't read it. Don't read reviews. Don't talk about it, and instead just, oh, I think this is it. This is what I'm thinking of. Yeah, where he gave like an actual panel talk. It's really interesting. I mean, the top comments, this dude, this man must have darkest secret on Howard for him to still be employed. Don't bother writing a good story for a movie. The audience is just going to eat popcorn and whisper to each other. End quote. The dialogue system was a mistake, said Todd, which this was one of the things Emil was super into for Fallout 4. In short, if you want to become a great writer, listen to all of his advice and do the exact opposite. It really is a fascinating talk, because a lot of his points in this are just the opposite of what you would think you should do. It's really fascinating. And there's one point at the very end. Let me see if I can find it. It's been like a year or two since I talked about this, or since I watched this, but let's see if I can find it.
But that's not the end, though. That's not the end of being a video game developer. Because the true mark of being a real developer is, as every developer knows, is waiting for reviews to come in, right? And then reading the reviews, of course, and hopefully, if you get lucky, ignoring the reviews, right?
I know it's like sort of a joke, ignore the reviews, but I think that reveals a lot. I think that reveals a lot about the mindset, where it's not like, okay, maybe the reviews and the gamers that are less than thrilled about some of the choices we made. It's not that they might have very valid critiques. No, just ignore them and celebrate the money that you're making. I think that reveals a lot. And, the rest of the interviews that he's done in the past also reveal something similar. And I think that it's an approach that explains a lot of the behavior at BGS, where they consistently make the same mistakes over and over and over again with all of their different games. And you're like, how are they not learning from this? it's wild. And Skyrim, yeah, you're right. Skyrim Enjoyer, this appropriate username for this. You're right. Emil, I think he is very talented as a creative mind, okay? I just think he should not have the leadership position. That's my stance, at least. And I don't, again, like we did that survey and I heard from some former BGS employees. I haven't been able to like totally confirm everything, so I'm not gonna like do a big breakdown report on any of it. But I've heard some stories and rumblings of the inner workings of BGS, and I just think that some of the leadership probably is responsible for a lot of the issues that they've had. I'll leave it there for now. But Skyrim's right. Emil has made some cool stuff, like the Dragon's Tongue in Skyrim. That's right. He's the one that like came up with the Dragon Tongue language. Basically, he came up with the lyrics for the main Dragonborn theme that was talked about in the making of the Skyrim documentary, or making of Skyrim documentary. And he's also done other stuff like trying to come up with how they would actually have the dragons writing based on the claws that would scrape into the rock and stuff. He's a very creative guy. There's no doubt about that. But I think at this point it's pretty clear. As like the head writer, his writing leaves a lot to be desired, because I mean, Fallout 4, Fallout 3, Skyrim, Fallout 76, Starfield, these are all games that he's been like a head writer on, and they all have laughably terrible stories. And so I'm just like, okay, I mean, being in charge of something brings some cool stuff, and it also brings some bad stuff, because I mean, they have laughably terrible reviews, and people openly tease the writing in these games because it's so freaking predictable, and it's just not particularly interesting. And I mean, the one exception was, I think, the Far Harbor DLC for Fallout 4. That's actually kind of interesting and a cool DLC. There were a couple quests in Starfield I thought were interesting, but like, that's it. Skyrim, I mean, again, like it's a sandbox game. It's not really meant to give you a lot to chew on. And I think that's perhaps where he excels, is in the quick, like escapist fantasy writing, where it doesn't take itself too seriously. But the problem is the rest of the games have started to take themselves more seriously, and his stuff hasn't really kept up with it, you know. But he's still a head honcho. He's going to be one of the leads in Elder Scrolls 6 and whatever comes after. And so like, this is the big thing, is if you're frustrated by BGS's approach with Fallout 4, Fallout 76, and then leading into Starfield, and now going into the Elder Scrolls 6, it's not going to change, because as you heard like out of the horse's mouth, like half jokingly, but I think that half jokingly is doing a lot of lifting. I genuinely think that they just kind of ignore the reviews. If the game has good player numbers, they just turn their brains off and stop thinking about it. And if they're not considering it and they're not listening to feedback like that, I don't expect the Elder Scrolls 6 to be particularly good. A lot of people are like, oh man, Starfield wasn't great, so now I'm just hoping for the Elder Scrolls 6. I'm like, who's going to tell them? Who's going to tell? I don't think it's going to be very good. Bethesda's washed for sure. Elder Scrolls 6 will be the what could have been. Creation engine is archaic. BGS cannot compete with UE5. They fail to meet industry standards and remain ignorant. There are certain things that the creation engine is very good at. And the biggest thing, and this is something that's not really discussed too much with the creation engine, but it's like biggest strength. And that is its physics sim. This article from PC Gamer was really simpy and weird. But basically this reveal during the announcement of Starfield, or the full reveal of Starfield, was one of the like key talking points. And it kind of turned into a meme, which was that one of the designers of Starfield over at BGS, I believe it was a woman, she said that she collected sandwiches and just kept them all in her ship and would pile them up. And the reason that this brings the physics sim up is because you can drop these physical objects in the game's world anywhere, and they have realistic physics inside the game world, which is cool. And there's other cool stuff you can do where like you can blast the zero gravity effect and everything will start floating and all the objects throughout the room start floating. Everything in your inventory has a realistic, fully modeled object that can be placed in the world with realistic physics, actual weights and things. And that's all cool. That's all cool. And that's one of the reasons why the creation engine has to have smaller areas, and also why it has to load in different instances where there's a lot of objects. And it's because the creation engine apparently can't really cull physics objects the way it might cull objects for rendering. You know, it's just, it doesn't really do that. How you can think about this in a lot of games, if I can mute this, this was shown off in a demo of how Horizon Zero Dawn culls things as you're rendering. And this is pretty standard. Pretty much every game engine will do this. But this just gives it a good kind of visual representation, is that as the field of view is moving, certain things are culled out and removed because the computer, or in this case, the console, doesn't need to render that stuff if it's not in the frame. Like, you just don't need to do it. You keep it in memory, but you don't need that actively being computed, right? And this is, you know, kind of when you're just culling things out of the frame, out of the game world when it's out of the frame. And other things will happen. So like, you know, if you imagine that there's like, I just got this in the mail, so I'll use this as an example. There's a book. It's a good book, by the way. But then there's an object behind the book. This is behind the book, but when you're rendering a frame, you can't see this right now. So if this were a game engine, it would cull this object and the back face of the book because it's not being rendered. They don't need that in the frame, so it'll cull it to save on memory and things. So culling is basically just a process of not bothering with something if it's going to cause processing issues or if it's not going to be seen anyways. And physics objects in the creation engine are one such issue, where there are so many things that have realistic physics at play at any given time that you have to have all of those loaded into memory at any given time, so that if you use the zero gravity effect, you know, those things realistically start floating and moving and stuff. But the problem is, within a game like Starfield, there would be so many things in the game that have physics on them that you couldn't just have all of that loaded into memory at all times, moving from planet to planet, city to city, whatever. So they'd have to find a way to load it in and pull it out when it's no longer needed. You lost me at this is a book, yeah. And MS Paint, I think you're right. So what they would realistically need to do, one of the responses to the survey I did described this very, very well, and in different ways, and I will probably screw it up by trying to draw it out, but I'll try to do my best. So what this person, who's a software engineer that works at a very large studio that makes massive open world games, what this person described to me was that there's a few ways that they've done this for different types of games. for games like Assassin's Creed Origins, for example, right? Massive game set in Egypt, it's huge. But that's not a game that has full realistic simulation of physics for every single object ever. They do have some things, so like they might have a crate that you can break or jars that you can break that, you know, fall and crumble down realistically once they're broken. But you'll notice that those despawn within a few seconds and they kind of fade into the ground and disappear. That's because they're basically culling it out of memory so that they don't have to keep that simulation running indefinitely. One of the other ways that he described it was that you could have a large map full of different zones. So if the player character is, let's just say, right here, and then they're moving through zones, what you could do is just unload all of the physics objects, which, you know, might be all of these. You could unload all of the physical objects that have physics sim on them once you leave that zone, and then load in the objects in this zone, and then unload those once you move into this zone. And so you only ever have one zone of objects loaded at a time. He said the other way that sometimes it's been done is that you might have like a physical space, a bubble basically around the player character, and as that moves, so do the things. So in this case, all the stuff inside the blue circle would be loaded in. Everything outside the blue circle would be culled out and dropped. The problem is, though, this is not how, like, this isn't how the creation engine works. It doesn't do this. And the reason it doesn't do this is because it never has had to. Because all of these sandwiches are in one room. In this case, in a specific room in your ship. And so once you leave your ship, yeah, they unload it then. They don't need that in the memory once you've left the ship, because the ship is its own instance. It's kind of like having a separate Word document for each and every little thing. All these sandwiches are stored, all the data about them is in this document. When you shut it down to open up the open world or the New Atlantis document, you don't need all that stuff because it's in a separate space, so you just focus on this thing you have open. And that's how the creation engine works. It's just by having each little bucket that it worries about one at a time. And the issue is, to make the game fully seamless, they would have to either get rid of this major strength of the creation engine, which is this crazy amount of physical simulation that they can do. They'd have to just dump it, or they'd have to find some way of dynamically culling physical objects as you move from room to room, space to space, and shift around, loading in and out in real time. And naturally, I think they realized that was such a huge undertaking, it probably wasn't worth it. Because imagine, like, you have all of those objects in your spaceship, and then you physically fly out of the atmosphere into a lower gravity space. And so how does that affect the physical objects in your ship? You'd have to dynamically code it for, like, gravitational forces changing in real time based on where you are. And I know they could just be like, oh, you have a grav drive or something, so it keeps gravity on your ship at all times. Okay. But even then, like, you're flying into a new city. You have to load in all of that stuff while also still having the stuff loaded in your ship. And then you walk away from your ship, you deload everything in your ship, but load in the stuff in front of you in the rest of the city. It's a huge undertaking and not easy. And as we know, BGS, if something's going to be a massive undertaking, they don't typically do it. And so this is just where they ended up, where instead they chose to just do things the way they had always done them, which is just have it loaded in each individual instance. And the game suffers as a result, because while it's cool to have a bunch of simulated sandwiches, it doesn't make for a better space game. You know, this is not that crazy. I kind of want to see what this person said in this. They're saying, I didn't really get Starfield until Bethesda revealed we could just go around stealing giant space sandwiches. It's been clear since the first proper reveal of Starfield that Starfield was going to be Bethesda's most ambitious RPG. 1,000 worlds, fully customizable spaceships, a new level of sandboxy freedom. There's certainly a lot of potential here, but every time it's been shown off, I've been unable to shrug off the feeling that it's all going to be a wee bit dull. Big, sure, but also dry. Who's going to tell him? This was really typified in the recent Starfield Direct, when we were promised that we could land on a planet, collect resources, do a mission, and maybe even stumble upon something unexpected. What the video actually showed us, though, was Starfield Space Explorer stumbling across an abandoned mine, the kind of thing you would find in nearly every RPG that's ever existed. Okay, I thought maybe there will be at least something weird and memorable in this abandoned mine. Nope, just some space bandits. I get it, you can't fill a sandbox like this exclusively with thrilling bespoke diversions. And if the combat is good enough, there are still opportunities to make a mine delving adventure a good time. Maybe there's some killer loot in there to make it all worthwhile. But it definitely doesn't feel showcase worthy. Where things really clicked for me was the sandwich heist. You can play Starfield as a dirty, rotten scoundrel flighting, I don't know, through space, and not just blowing up any ships you encounter, but boarding them too. Now, that alone was enough to pique my interest. This turns every ship potentially into a sort of dynamic dungeon waiting to be explored and looted. Space is an evocative setting, but since it's largely empty, there's a risk of it becoming incredibly dull. Turning ships into locations you can visit helps avoid that issue. Sort of. One developer admitted that they just liked boarding and taking over ships specifically to steal sandwiches. They have a place in their cargo hold dedicated to their ill-gotten snacks, just a pile of sandwiches spilling off a table. It's kind of delightful. I also find it incredibly funny and so typical of video games that it's just one type of sandwich: white bread, cheese, lettuce, and ham. The most generic of all sandwiches. We're in the far-flung future, but we're still eating the same thing. Maybe ham comes from a space pig. The sandwiches are also pretty big, massive, really. What's going on in the future that demands such hefty loaves of bread? I really hope we'll be able to find a book that explains the lore behind this. I need it. It's kind of the pointless fun but personal quest that makes me love games like The Elder Scrolls and Fallout, filling homes with big wheels of cheese and bones. And until now, the kind of whimsy seemed to be missing from Starfield. I'm not all that invested in fantasy, Civil Wars, prophecies, or finding my lost child, but if I'm playing in a sandbox, I want to do some weird shit. And to see someone already doing this fills me with hope regarding potential shenanigans. And then traits. Yeah, we always knew Starfield was going to be big, but now I'm convinced it might actually be fun too. And really, that's what I want more than anything. The scale is largely irrelevant to me. I just want to go on stupid adventures and have a lark. If Starfield can live up to that, I might be converted. Oops. We know how that ended. Again, it's like a cool initial weird thing, but I think that that was a funny, quirky thing that the Creation Engine could do back in 2011. I don't know why that's compelling in 2023 in this case. And it wasn't. It didn't end up being compelling. It was a cool, like, funny little tidbit, but again, people just would like more. And Physics Sim is awesome, but Starfield doesn't do anything cool with it, which is the key for, like, I think in Skyrim, doing Fus Ro Dah and having all of the physical objects in the room go flying when you blasted the enemy across the room. That was a cool thing, and it was a cool use of something very unique that the Creation Engine could do. Starfield doesn't really do anything with that. They have the zero gravity effect that you might have. You might have it equipped, you might not, but it's not like a core tenet of Starfield gameplay is taking advantage of the physics sim. And you would think that they could easily do this with having like space battles and stuff, but really it just doesn't. There really isn't much of anything. And I mean, even like within combat and stuff on other people or enemy ships, there's almost never cool things with like zero gravity or like altered gravity effects, because they're trying, like, the grav drive broke while you were boarding them or something. There's just not many interesting ways to tie it in. So it's like the greatest strength of the Creation Engine just isn't really used for anything cool other than stacking sandwiches on tables in Starfield. And I think that that's why a lot of people are like, it just seems to be like you're doubling down on the Creation Engine for no reason at all. Seems weird. It's just a gimmick that never plays a significant role in gameplay or narrative, so it just kind of feels like a waste of resources. Well, and it's like, people will often say, no, BGS shouldn't go away from the Creation Engine. There's no need, because they have a lot of strengths with the Creation Engine. It does a lot of really cool stuff. And while I agree, there are many cool things that the Creation Engine can do, it's stuff like this. And this stuff, the Creation Engine doesn't really, or rather the game doesn't take advantage of it. It's just like, okay, you can stack any object dynamically. That's cool. Interesting. Yeah, Noob, I agree. Building ships in Starfield, I think that's the coolest feature in the entire game. I love the ship customization stuff. I thought it was awesome. But once the ship is built, it's like, okay, it just doesn't feel that interesting after that. But this is in the business of selling games, not making them. Everything they do is to build hype. Dumb practice, in my opinion. Yeah, Noob, I think at this point, unfortunately, that's where it's ended up. Like Skyrim at the time that it launched was a phenomenon and was huge, but I think Todd has just, as the internet has remembered more and more, people started looking back and seeing like the clips of him talking about Fallout 3 and talking about the 200 endings it would have and being like, okay, but that's, or was that with Skyrim? I forget which one he said that about. And it's like, that's not really true though. That's not accurate. I don't know how you got to that number, or all of the little lies with like Fallout 76 or Fallout 4 and all that. And I think that Todd at his core is a salesman who also makes video games, and he's very good at being a salesman, but I think the goodwill has been burnt a lot, and now people are much more skeptical, and I'm very proud of people for that. Yeah, Skyrim has infinite quests, and there's procedural fetch quests. Same thing with like Fallout 4, where it's like, you're technically right. Like, you'll never have an empty quest log where there's just nothing left, because there should always be somebody to issue another fetch quest. Unless you kill every NPC in the game. But like, you still know what you're doing when you say that, right? You know, how's it good? Everybody laughs at him. I mean, I'm saying a lot of people do laugh at it now. Even with Starfield though, the level of hype around Starfield was insane. I told you guys about the guys that were trying to hack into my server to get my footage of the game, like during the review process. People were trying to hack into my NAS to get access to the footage I had stored on there, because they were so desperate for any inkling of footage or information about the game. Like, it's one of the few studios that can still get to just an asinine level of hype. And I think it's made worse by some of the content creators that specifically cater to it. But I mean, it's wild. It's wild. So Todd still has a hold on some people. I think every time there's a release, though, the number of people that buy into it gets, you know, smaller and smaller and smaller. But No Man's Sky is superior in every aspect. I think No Man's Sky, it's a survival, like, sim game, sort of. Probably more survival than anything else. And it's good, but it's also not very approachable. Like, I've tried to get into it a few times, and it's like, every time I've tried, people have been like, oh, well, it just takes like, 20 hours or so to get your feet under you. And I'm like, I don't know, man. He took my thing. Red flag.